Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy interview series. Uh, and I hope that for some of you who've seen some of our interviews, I hope you've enjoyed them. Today it is a really great pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague of mine who will be talking to us about some areas of Cuba and Cuban law and policy, which is about as current as you possibly can get. And I refer to my friend José Gabilondo, who I will now introduce and who will be talking to us about his work. José was born in Santiago de Cuba. He has joined the Florida International University College of Law after working in financial market regulations at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. He teaches corporate finance, no shock. He teaches corporate finance, banking regulation, and tax. Um, Thank you. Thank you for doing that so I don't have to. His scholarship focuses on financial markets and Cuba studies, and he is an outstanding scholar in both. His work has appeared in the Harvard Latinx Law Review, the Journal of Corporation Law, Wake Forest Law Review, Catalejos, and Unijuris in Cuba, among others. He's the author of Bank Funding, Liquidity, and Capital Adequacy, a Law and Finance Approach, and co-author of Corporate Finance, Debt, Equity, and Derivative Markets and Their Intermediaries in the American Casebook series. So for those of you law students who will have to learn this stuff through that, now you can see the guy who's made your lives interesting. Right. He's been a featured speaker at meetings of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, where he has contributed greatly. And again, my personal thanks for that work. The American Association of Law Schools, the American Association of University Professors, LATCRIT, which is a great group, and the Latin American Studies Association. He's a nationally recognized commentator in the Spanish language media on financial and economic matters. And a really nice guy too. and quite personal. All right, so with that introduction, we can get down to business. And I want to start with the way I usually start, with a kind of general question for you. How did you become interested in studying the Cuban economy?
Well, Larry, first of all, thanks so much for putting together the series and for including me. I'm really delighted to be able to talk with you. I came from, well, we came from Santiago when I was 4 years old. So we went to New York for 1 year and then to Boston. So I grew up in a little Cuban nucleus surrounded by Irish and Italian Americans. There weren't any other Cubans, but I think, like a lot of us, I grew up hearing the stories about life in Cuba, life before the revolution, during the revolution, during the process of leaving. And even though I didn't know any other Cubans growing up, it formed me, and it was certainly part of my reality. And I felt like I understood what my parents had experienced. But I sort of put it out of my mind till I was a senior in college. And in my senior year, I went to Cuba for the first time. And I'm happy that I went. It was before El Periodo Especial. And that really was another Cuba. And so I'm happy that I had some experience with that. And I thought it was, more than eye-opening, transformative. But then I sort of put it out of my mind and went on with my career and went to law school. Became very interested in financial matters, and then went to Washington, and remained interested in Cuba, but didn't go back for a while. And I was working at the Treasury, not in OFAC, in a banking and finance division of the General Counsel's office. And I kept thinking about Cuba. I kept wanting to connect, and also I sort of felt, after a decade working in Washington, I kind of pined for an environment like my family's. I pined for ethnicity. I realized that's sort of what I was missing. So I applied for a teaching job, and I got a law teaching job. And as you know, you get a summer stipend to do research. And I thought, well, what do I want to do? Well, I really want to go to Cuba, and I really want to use this to begin to in a more systematic way, understand that part of my past. Because I still didn't really know a lot of Cubans. I only knew the people in my family. And so I wrote an article about the Cuban Central Bank, which was part of a series of reforms in the late 90s, and it was part of how Cuba had begun to adapt to a world without the Soviet Union as its main patron. And so that was my first law review article, and from that point on, I was very interested in it. Now, in truth, I mean, I work in three areas. My main area of scholarship is banking and finance, and that tends to be more about domestic finance and the banking sector. My second, and it's really a minor, is about Cuba studies, because since that point, I always wanted to have part of my life dedicated to Cuba work. And the third area is gender. Originally heterosexuality studies, but now gender more widely. And I'm very grateful that as an academic, I feel that I've always been able to operate on all three tracks. I have to balance my time sort of, I think I'm mostly, like 80% banking and finance, maybe, 10, 15% Cuba, and maybe 5, 10% gender. And that's kind of how I divide my time. And
Do you see, I've got to
oh,
ask you,
oh,
and
please.
please forgive me, do you see a overlap between the three? I mean, are there synergies that are possible that you might have taken advantage of as you work through the three areas?
Well, for me, I used economics, banking, and finance as a tool for looking at Cuba, in part because I didn't want to get into the areas of Cuban area studies that are so politicized, dealing with human rights, immigration, and U.S.-Cuba relations. I knew that the financial frame was a bridge that I could use to get into Cuba. But then later on, I mean, during the last, I would say, 10 years or so, I did have an opportunity to work on gender issues in Cuba. And it started really because, as you know, Raul Castro's daughter was very active in promoting and creating a space really for gays and lesbians, really more for transgendered individuals. And so that really created an opening for me. And so she was very active in a women's. Okay. So what I began to be active in is a women's and gender conference that they have in Havana. I used to present there, and I really enjoyed it. I felt like it was a community where I could integrate both things. And so to that extent, I've been able to overlap. But in general, I think, as an academic, I've thought, well, each area has its own structure, and I sort of abide by that. But yeah, sometimes I've been able to cross over.
Right. Excellent. So let me ask you something, just in terms of the studies. Are there any methodological challenges involved in studying Cuba?
Well, I think there are lots of them, and they make Cuba a challenging but very interesting place to study. And I think the main one is access to Cuban sources. The sanctions that OFAC imposes are primarily an embargo on transactions and financial flows, but they're also an embargo on thought and a certain kind of mental exchange, academic exchange. And I think that's why when you grow up in this country, you really have a very incomplete understanding of the reality of Cuba. So the first challenge I found was, access to sources, and but the Cuban government hasn't helped, because they've often not been forthcoming about a lot of material. So it's been hard to get information, and it has also, for me, been harder to get input from Cuban officials. I would write an article, and I would send it in draft form, someone, and because I wanted them to have an opportunity to respond. I wanted to know what I was missing, but I almost never got an answer. On my first trip on the Cuban Central Bank trip, I did meet with a series of economists, but I found that hard. Now, the upside of that is that I've had to infer some things, and I think that's something that I haven't had to do in other areas where there's much more transparency. And academic inference, it's kind of interesting. And so I'll give you an example. I'm doing this article now on La Tarea Ordenamiento, which restructures the way Cuba is going to, well, it restructures many things, but one of the things it restructures is the government's internal accounting for exports and imports. And now you can find out what they're going to do, but I'm still unclear about what they did before, and in a couple of areas, and it's relevant. So I lay out, well, this is what is known, this is what I think they did, because I think this would be the most logical way of serving the interest that they were trying to serve. So I kind of feel like in most other areas, I don't have to do that kind of inference, but when you're dealing with incomplete sources and a lack of transparency, you get to do that, and I think that's kind of interesting.
All right. Well, you've now piqued my interest, so I want to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. So the first question that came to mind is, and this is what had become a very political and American problem over the course of the last several years.
Mm-hmm.
There's always problems of lack of information, but what about the proliferation of misinformation?
Well, yeah.
Does that present challenges as well?
Do you mean misinformation originating in Cuba or misinformation originating in the United States?
Yes.
Okay. Well, excuse me. Well, I think it's you have to address each one separately, and in a way, the Cuban information is different. There's less of it, and I also understand some of it because it comes out of a state, because a lot of it is a sovereign communication. I see it differently. What I have found more challenging is what I think of as all of the exile infotainment that has been generated, much of it in Miami. And I think you have to name names. There are certain institutions that I think have made a cottage industry out of engaging with the Cuban American experience of loss and nostalgia. And that's why it's exile, and it's infotainment, even though it's painful, because what that whole cottage industry is speaking to is a community of people, that didn't really think they were leaving their country forever, and that has produced a deep feeling of loss. So I think the problem with that whole body of literature is that it doesn't really operate as academic work, because it's not empirical and it's not really rigorous. Its goal is to kind of keep alive a certain kind of emotional approach to Cuba. And before Fidel Castro died, it was really a very kind of a personalized study of an individual that ignored the larger institutionality of Cuba. That, I think, is one of its greatest defects. I remember, I remember telling my mother once that, oh, I was invited to do a book on Cuban law, and she laughed and said, oh, well, that's going to be the shortest book that's ever been written. And it was part of this view that there is no law in Cuba. And that's a shocking statement, especially to all the lawyers and legal institutions that are in Cuba. But I think it was part of and it really was like a hegemonic image of Cuba that was created in large part in Miami, in part by some of the institutions that are part of the University of Miami. And and so I think that's you know, you have to contest that. That part of my work, part of the goal of my work is to contest that, and it's very easy to contest that because that's a, you know, those are very flimsy kinds of areas of study. So I wrote I mean, in fact, one of the earlier articles I wrote was about what I call the Cuban American Oedipal conflict, because I think the problem of being a Cuban American, especially if you live in Miami, now I grew up in Boston, it was different for me, is that you introject the parental and the grandparents' experience of loss, and you don't intermediate it with anything. So their life and loss becomes your life and loss. And I really do think that what you have to do is you have to go and encounter Cuba on your own. In the end, you may end up ratifying what you thought originally, but it's a very it's a very infantilizing institution that we have.
Yeah.
And I really saw it when I came to Miami. And so, you know, part of my I mean, I came to Miami. I wanted to be part of a Cuban American institution. It is FIU is the one that is the university that outside of Havana has the most you know, Cuban American students. But it also felt like being popped back into my family, where I was open to certain ideas, you know, about Cuba that were heretical.
All right, well, this is fascinating, but if I may,
Please.
let me play devil's advocate for a
Sure.
second. So I hear what you're saying, and then I think to myself, oh, but wait. And the reason I'm asking this is we're actually working through this in our class on international affairs and the way in which ideology tends to color reality. And
Uh-huh.
so from my perspective, I hear what you're saying, and then I say, but wait a minute, even that has extraordinary value in two respects. One is as data, because in fact what it does is tell you
Yes.
how people are imposing meaning in ways that are or ought to be incomprehensible if they in fact use other pieces of data or information to reasonably come to a
Mhm.
proper view of the world. But then the second thing I think of is, irrespective of that, not just as data, that having created this meaning, they then, by acting on it, also create the facts around it as if it
Mhm.
were real. And if you do it long enough, and if you believe strong enough, this is almost magic, right? In their
Mm.
community, it does become fact, and it does affect the way in which they tend to relate to the world.
Absolutely. And I really like the way you put it, because in this area, it does become like a cosmogenic phenomenon. They create the world. And I mean, in a very concrete way, they create, you know, the Cuban, especially Cuban Americans, have created the world by capturing the foreign policy apparatus of the United States, such that those the experiences of that ethnic minority become the pattern that forms U.S. You know, the foreign policy of an extremely important country, and so it does become you know, it does become a universe.
Yeah.
Um, I also, though, I don't mean to suggest that I've reached a stable point, because in fact I struggle with questions of normativity whenever I do anything about Cuba, and how do I locate myself in this situation? Because I think, well, now wait a minute. If I were in Cuba, who would I be? Would I, you know, maybe I would be a human rights activist, or maybe I'd have an independent blog, or maybe I'd be a civil servant in a ministry. I don't know, but but who I am now is I'm a part of the U.S. academic community, and so I frame my normativity, I frame my argument as part of that, and uh, and so I think no doubt, I mean, like any country, Cuba has internal problems, and it can be criticized. The government can be criticized for a variety of things. But what has most sort of agitated me is the way Cuba as an entity is treated in the U.S. system, and I view that as a larger evil. So I sort of focus those are the Goliath that I want to challenge is more hegemonic ways of understanding Cuba in the United States.
Okay.
And I think, because every now and then I've gotten people like, well, how come you don't criticize some of these things in Cuba? And I think it's because I follow my own ordering principle about what are the normative debates that I'm going to be a part of. And I think with Cuba, and I think with Cuba, that's the hardest one.
Okay. Now you used an interesting word, which American academics certainly have shied away from since they began shying away from religion towards other either value systems or to the worship or to the worship of data. You use the word evil. All right. And so I've got to ask, so why evil?
Well, actually, I'm not. In what context did I use the word
You
evil?
said, well, because I was you mentioned the way in which the Goliath that developed its policy in relation to Cuba, the hegemon, as
Yeah.
against the small, and then in that context, you said, well, the policy is to a certain extent evil, and so at that point, whoa, okay, this is kind of cool.
I thought the word you were going to pick was normativity.
No, I
I
like
thought that
normativity.
I thought that's what he's going to talk about in this
No,
relativized.
no.
Well, it's funny. I tell my students in law classes, like, don't use the words justice. There are certain words you shouldn't use because they're too multivalent and too, constructed and try to avoid. I think and it's also, in law, we use evil in that technical way in terms of, the evil that a statute or the mischief that a statute is trying to police. But I think I was reacting to the fact that I really do think that U.S. foreign policy on Cuba is depraved, and I actually, I do think it has genocidal elements because it's targeting a people. It's targeting this people on an island. The curious thing is that it is expats of that country that are driving this genocidal project, and that's weird. That's weird. I think what Cuban American, I mean, I can think of only two groups in this country, two ethnic minorities that have had this disproportionate influence on foreign policy. One, I think, is Jewish Americans, in terms of a very small minority's ability to influence policies with Israel. In that case, to help Israel. But in the case of Cuba, you have this other, smaller, probably much smaller ethnic minority that has similarly harnessed the, U.S. foreign policy apparatus, but not to help, but instead to, to isolate and to harm. But I mean, while we're on that question and we're talking about words, an important set of words that I had to work out for me was blockade or embargo, because language is so important in this area. Here at FIU, we have a Cuba Council, or we had at one point, and it sort of is a steering committee of Cuba activities. And they once asked me to go and talk to them, and so I did. And one of the things that what I brought them was I had a little graphic that had on one column it had what I call exile speak, and on the other column was island speak. And what I was saying is, when it comes to this topic, language matters a lot, like you were saying, it forms reality. And there really are these two extremely separate registers of concepts. So is it exile or is it diaspora? Is it a human rights violation, or is it or is it about autonomy, national autonomy? And I said, if you only speak with the words of one register, you're situating yourself, and that really limits your ability to connect. Now, many people, I mean, hey, no one likes to be situated,
Right.
so
Well,
but
but
and some people didn't like that, but I stand by it.
yeah.
That idea.
And you're absolutely right. People don't like to be to have that done to them, but they do like to signal. And perhaps the
Yeah,
easiest way of signaling is by the
yeah,
way in
yeah.
which they resort to language.
uh,
Um,
Absolutely.
and so you can either signal opposition, alliance, or in some cases, among my my favorite ways of using this, you can signal irony or contradiction. Um,
Uh,
that is to move to signal that you recognize, which is precisely what you're doing here, right? To signal that you're recognizing that what people are doing is using these languages to signal by investing them not just with a substantive meaning, but also with a political, a social meaning, and a
sure.
meaning that relates to an agenda going forward or to an objective, right?
I like irony as a strategy because it's a way of making the point without aligning yourself. And it's, often, I joke sometimes in the academy, I think there's an irony deficiency. But actually, irony has can have a very important role.
It can.
Um, for me, I mean, I started thinking of U.S. sanctions as a blockade only about 5 years ago. I really resisted using that word, and I did so because I knew it would situate me. It would situate me automatically in a particular register, and I thought, well, I mean, I'm not that register. I'm some kind of hybrid. But I started to read about it and think about it, and actually I read this book. There's a wonderful Cuban jurist, Rodolfo Davalos Fernandez. He was very active in finance, and he wrote this book, Embargo or Blockade. And as I engaged with it, I thought, well, what is it? What makes it a blockade? It's not a physical encirclement. But in the end, I was persuaded by the idea that because, well, and obviously countries have a right to, more than anyone, you're an expert in these areas, to organize their bilateral relationships. And multilateral organizations sometimes impose sanctions collectively. But what I find troubling about U.S. sanctions, and it's no secret, it's their extraterritoriality and the way they interfere, not bilaterally, but multilaterally with other sovereigns. And really, they disrespect what I think of as the rules of the game. And so when I thought about it, I thought, well, that's those formal qualities make it a blockade, and also the relentlessness of it, that it's lasted for 60 years. And I mean, legally, the embargo, the blockade, it's fascinating because it's so complex legally in terms of the number of pronouncements and the concurrent legal authority. The Library of Congress has this. I love the Library of Congress. They have this brief that lays out statutory authorities for Cuba sanctions, and they're so complex. It's an amazing thing. And so, as a legal matter, it's very interesting. But I think as an ethical matter, I got to the point where I thought, oh, you know what? I'm comfortable calling it a blockade, not because I feel adherence to island speak register, no, but because to my way of thinking, it is a blockade. But language begins to, again, it's super important in this area.
I know that's absolutely right. Let me bring you back though.
Okay.
The other point that I wanted to talk about, you're talking about the Cuban economic reforms that were announced at the end of
Mm,
last year, and of course this is a part of the conversation we're having about methodological challenges.
Sure.
And you mentioned the necessity of building fairly strong interpretive muscles, right?
Yeah.
So that you can read either between the lines, or you can find lines where there are
Right.
gaps, right? And so and the example you gave was, well, I now know because they finally, after
Yeah.
God, how many decades, they finally have written this stuff out so that I know at least formally what they're supposed to be doing. And from that, maybe I can interpolate chronologically backwards
Yeah.
to figure out the system that they had undergone before. So as you were saying that, I was thinking, well, wait a minute. What if, in fact, what the reforms actually suggest is not that they moved to a new system, but that there was no system before?
Well, that is a possibility. I mean, that is a possibility. Um, I and I can't discard it. But let me give you more details about the particular zone of this inference,
Okay.
and why I don't think that there was no system. And the other reason is, over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, I've gotten to know a lot of Cuban academics, lawyers, and economists, and they're just first rate. I mean, they're just so it's not the case that there's an a knowledge deficit, or that's just not the case.
Yeah, no,
So,
and I wasn't suggesting a
oh no, no,
knowledge
I didn't mean to
deficit.
suggest that you were suggesting that.
Yeah. I was suggesting a quite deliberate policy of creating, in very broad strokes, an approach, but then effectively leaving a large hole that would be filled by pragmatic
Oh,
and ultra
oh,
flexible exercises of
uh,
administrative
well,
discretion,
well,
so that in effect there's no system, there's just
yeah.
this vat of administrative decision making.
Right. No, I mean, it's funny. I want to follow up on that point that you just made before I follow up on your
Uh,
earlier point,
uh,
because I think why I think one of the things that makes Cuba so interesting is its exceptionalism. It really has done so many things in a way that no other country does. And so I think that means you have to have like a native theory of Cuban structure and Cuban ontology to understand Cuba. And for me, I think kind of the foundations of that is, maybe it's a cliche, Fernando Ortiz, and this idea of syncretism and hybridity. That for me, that I realize, whatever I'm doing, whenever I'm dealing with a Cuban thing, I'm like, well, wait a minute, let me let go of the paradigms I know, and let me see if I can infer a paradigm here. And where I noticed that is I wrote an article about the constitutional reform that you've also written about, and I was looking at the question about whether Cuba was a secular country or whether it was an atheist country, and where I ended up is it was neither atheist nor secular, because the government had carved out a space exactly along the lines of what you said. It was a space of indeterminacy, so that it was a mistake to say that Cuba was an atheist country. The Soviet Union was,
right.
but Cuba was not. Cuba actually, they had this space of indeterminacy that was room for being pragmatic. So what you just said is, that's absolutely right. And in a way, I mean, that's the freedom that comes from being disconnected to the global mainstream, to not being in the Bretton Woods mainstream, or I mean, being your own thing. And that, by the way, I think is one of the great advantages of going to Cuba. It's and it's the ultimate mental floss. It's the ultimate place to get off the grid and re-engage with your own thinking. But back to your question about whether I was one could over infer a system when maybe there was no system. The thing that has been an issue about Cuba for many years, and it's something that I know you know a lot about, is the multiple exchange rates that they had.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with the Cuban economy wasn't just that it had multiple currencies. It had the peso, it had the dollar, and it had this proxy dollar, the convertible peso. Well, other countries have that too. That's not really weird. And what made the economy a little weirder is that Cuba kept its government books using a different internal exchange rate, that the street rate that connected pesos, national pesos, with convertible pesos and with dollars was 1 to 24. $1 or a convertible peso would get you 24 national pesos. But government books were kept on this fiction. And in fact, it was a fiction from before the revolution that 1 peso equaled $1.
Oh.
And that monetary identity was then amended when the convertible peso was introduced to, 1 peso equals $1 equals 1 convertible peso. And that was the way the books were kept. But what turns out is that's not the way the books were kept for all firms, and that different sectors and different firms their activities were booked at different rates, and that even the fictional 1-for-1 rate affected business differently based on whether they were importers or exporters, because that fictional rate subsidized importers. Because if you were a Cuban company and you had 500 pesos, using that fictional rate, you could get $500 worth of imports. And so then those imports would come into the system, and in truth, and they would be subsidized by the state. And in truth, that subsidy would be passed on in the retail market, because that kept imported prices lower than they would have been if the incoming price had reflected 500 times 24, 12,000. So importers were better off. They got a subsidy. Exporters were harmed, because if you were an exporter and you sold $500 worth of I don't know, say nickel, you were credited only 500 pesos in terms of your internal account. Now, I see that as a domestic tariff. I see that as a domestic tariff operating through an internal exchange rate. And so, and they did this a lot. And now arbitrage situation. And I see that where the government has created an arbitrage market. And so what I assumed was, well, was there a master account where you kept track of all the subsidies and all the tariffs?
Right.
Because, what happened was, okay, there were firms that were paying the tariff and generating this little surplus. And then there were firms that were, using a subsidy, eating that little surplus. Now, to my way of thinking, I think, okay, maybe there was not there was certainly no ledger that was published, and maybe there wasn't even a government-wide ledger that ran, through which you would run all the subsidies and all the tariffs. That would have made sense. I mean, you would want to do that. Maybe there wasn't, or maybe there was, or maybe certain sectors had sector-specific clearing accounts that where you would run through the gains and losses. So I don't know. I understand it in terms of a single clearing account. The way I see it is, there was a single account, and everything was processed through it. But
Right.
maybe there wasn't. Maybe there were several accounts. And one reason why I think that is that if you look at Cuban, beginning in the, before La Tarea, they started to use single accounts for certain government transactions. Like the IMF recommends that the countries have a central cash account, like a Treasury account that operates, through which everything runs. The United States has the general fund, which is this notion of it's like a single, and it's like an
Right.
entity that all the budget runs through. And so what I see is, and it's funny. I mean, this is like the unwritten story of Cuba's attempt at prudent financial management. There were internal attempts to make sense of the economy. There were internal attempts to keep records on a centralized basis. But when I mentioned an inference, I don't know if they had a single clear. I don't know. But what they say now is that the old system didn't let them see what was a profitable business because it was being subsidized, and that the old system punished businesses that were generating forex. They care about it now. I assume they cared about it then, and that maybe there were people who had an informal sense, an unwritten sense, who do this all day long, and maybe but my sense is that there were some kind of clearing account or ledgers, and so that's what I mean. But they don't talk about any of them. So I'm inferring that they existed.
Right, right, right. No, and I think that's exactly right. They don't talk about them. They may or may not have existed. They may or may not have had some use, but perhaps critically, there may have been some kind of wall between its utility as a means of keeping track of things and its value in either setting or understanding policy. And so what might have wound up happening is that there were two tracks which the reforms of the last part of last year maybe are now trying to correct.
Yeah.
To take that wall down between a willingness of the policy elite to do things in a particular way. And you saw that specifically, for example, with the valuation and trading principles of ALBA, versus the record keeping and the need to clean things up so that you know exactly what is going out and what is coming in, however you value them. And we can have disputes about value,
Right.
but at least And so maybe in a sense, and so your description is actually quite brilliant. That may be what's going on. We are seeing an attempt. It's backhanded, it's subtle, but maybe an attempt finally after 70 years or so to take that to take the wall down. Now, and whether it succeeds or not remains to be seen, I suspect. But yes, and so it really is a fascinating time to be looking at this
Yes.
at these things from the Cuban perspective.
And I really like the way you put it, because it has been said, and I think it's true, that one of the shortcomings of the revolution was that it was sort of hostile to professional economics. Che Guevara was president of the central bank. And so it really seemed like there were areas where they opted for ideology rather than a it could have been a left-wing technical approach, but
Yeah.
it was a highly idealized. So when you talk, I like the way you put it, that wall that you talk about, what I imagine is a wall, but between a group of people who were much more concerned with ideology, and another group that made up of economists that was willing to experiment, abide by more conventional macroeconomic rules. And I think you're right. I mean, I think one of the things that the Tarea signals is that view is winning ground. And the evidence of that is the person who's in charge of implementation of the lineamientos is this economist, Marino Murillo Jorge, and he's amazing. I mean, he's absolutely amazing, because he doesn't talk about Adam Smith or Hayek, or the invisible hand, but he's talking about market forces, and he's saying things like, whether we like it or not, market forces exist. And he's talking about the market in ways that I think are different. One, there's virtually no blame of the U.S. embargo. Yes, it's mentioned sometimes as a structural factor, but it's not used as the excuse that explains why nothing can be done and why we can't assume some responsibility in this experiment. And I think that absence, I think it's noteworthy. I think, oh, that's interesting. And so he's the spokesman for the reform. He's the architect for it. And we talked about methodology. Let me suggest another methodological view. I don't know how you agree, whether you agree with this, but I think that Mesa Redonda counts as an authoritative source in terms of law and culture. And I say that because, Mesa Redonda is this nightly news show that it's pure government, and it's where the government announces new things. The next day they'll be in Granma or Juventud Rebelde. But it's clear to me that those other sources pick up off of Mesa Redonda. And Mesa Redonda is the via. So I view it as a kind of source that explains things that you can't tell from looking at the 100 laws.
No. I mean, that's absolutely right. You, me, and everyone else who's interested in the subject, whether you agree with them, despise them, love them or not, are going to be tuning in. If only because
I do, every night.
That's right. And in a lot of ways for me, sometimes I will watch it the way I used to read. I was taught to read Pravda or Izvestia, right? And so you read what they say to get a sense of what they didn't say, or you read it because it's going to indicate something, or you're getting at least some quantum. But yes, no, I absolutely agree. Those are the sources.
They are, yeah.
But then again, we're hardly in a position to talk about the how shall we say it, the irregularness of those sources when most Western liberal democratic states now appear to drive their policy making through tweeting, right? And I'm not talking about the Americans.
Yes.
Now. I'm not talking about the Americans. I'm talking about the French president. I'm talking about the British prime minister.
Yes.
I mean, everyone is doing this. So now everyone is sitting around, the news sources certainly are sitting around, and maybe even the administrative units are sitting around waiting to see what their bosses are tweeting about.
Well, Larry, that's exactly right. Because I think that Tarea is fascinating. And one of the things I realized in these communications, and he's also appeared before El Poder Popular, is, he's talking to the insiders. This is how they're learning about these changes that are going to transform their lives by reducing subsidies for state enterprises and increasing.
But it's also the people and the words that have been approved by the first secretary and therefore either serve as quasi-official trial balloons to get a sense of where it's going, and then those can be popped and there's no embarrassment, or as the announcement about what is to come.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I'm relieved to see that you think there's value there too. Now, I think Mr. Murillo signals something different because, in the 90s, there was Carlos Laje, who was the economics minister, and he was allowed to do some things. And then, something happened to him that happened to a lot of officials, cayó en desgracia. And, if you look at the Cuban state, it seemed like very few people were allowed to become identifiable as individuals with particular ideas. Ricardo Alarcón, he was able to. Eusebio Leal, until recently, but those are really big exceptions.
And they were very, very careful.
That's probably true.
As crazy as they might have appeared to us outside, my sense from spending years listening to them was that they were also extremely careful. The people who tended to have political accidents tended to forget themselves. I'm using a 19th century term. Tended to forget themselves and their relationship to the first secretary, and of course bad things happen to them.
It may be, but I think we're in a different moment, and I think Mr. Murillo illustrates that because he is the voice of the reform. It was the president who announced what the exchange rate, what the dollar peso exchange rate would be. Right. But he improvises. He's he's so clearly identified with all of this. And that's why, to me, it really feels like, wow, this is really a technical project. They may get it wrong. No doubt they will get it wrong. There will be mistakes will be made. Mistakes will be made, but they're being made in a technical way. And so I find that very refreshing and different. I know that with Cuba, many people, there are skeptics who say, how is this? The more things change, the more they stay the same. Is this any different? I think in some ways it is. I think in terms of tone, in terms of the autonomy that Mr. Murillo has demonstrated, and that he always says, oh, things are interesting. He says, oh, isn't this interesting? And I think that's really interesting. So there you have this government official who is acting like an academic with intellectual curiosity, and it's really interesting. So I hear a freedom of thought when he speaks that I've never heard before. And so, that makes me optimistic.
Well, speaking of freedom, to what extent will the length of rope within which will define the space within which he can be free is determined by or subject to the observation of the military?
Well, that's a very good question, because I think that one of the things that the Tarea is doing is, it's certainly not privatizing anything. It's not privatizing state enterprises, but it's drawing a fiscal border around state enterprises, because
which means the military.
Which means the military, and that's different. What I get out of these communications is that, that state officials distinguish between what they view as the public functions of the state, and they call it el sector presupuestado, and the sector empresarial. And the difference, as far as I can tell, is the public functions aren't expected to generate revenues, but enterprises are. State enterprises are expected to create revenue to feed and to subsidize the state's public sector. And so I think, wow, that's really interesting. And that seems different to me. Now, the government has said that they're going to keep subsidizing businesses for a while, but one of the things they did is, and it's not available publicly. This is the kind of thing you'd like to be able to see, but they did a simulation of which state enterprises would be profitable and which ones wouldn't under the new currency, under the new monetary regime. A stress test, like the ones that banks have to do. If this happens, what happens if this? So they did an internal stress test, and they identified that I think there were something like 1,700 separate businesses. 400 of them would be in the red. Typically, exporters would be in the black because they would benefit from the getting full credit for foreign currency. But importers would, they'd be in the red because they were the ones that were most accustomed to the subsidy, and that those 400 businesses were associated with 300,000 jobs. And so I just thought, wow, they thought about it that far into this. Like, they asked themselves the question, who would lose a job if we required state enterprises to be profitable? I mean, just asking the question.
All right, but now let me play devil's advocate. Devil's advocate. I am sitting in the room with the first secretary, because it's not not with my government hat, but with my party hat. And I hear what you've just said. And I say to myself, you know what? No problem. Absolutely no problem. You know why? Those 400 enterprises that are now in the red, they are all going to be converted to ministerial departments.
Wow.
Part of the government's expenses of operating the welfare system for the people, and that all of the other enterprises will have to make up the slack. Now I've solved my problem. All the enterprises are in the black because what had been quote unquote privatized, although it was privatized in public companies, what had been privatized merely by changing their designation the way that Angela Merkel changed the name of the Constitution for Europe to the Treaty for Europe and then got it passed with no objections, right? Merely by, and this goes back to where we started with the way in which we invest words with meaning and then press
Sure.
we have magic. Now all of a sudden we have magic. And so all the bad state enterprises have disappeared because now they become part of government. And since government is a losing proposition in
By
terms,
definition, right.
yeah, now well, we just have to raise money for the greater glory of the policy objectives of the state.
That is absolutely possible. And that's, that's what countries, like you said, that's a sovereign prerogative. That's the powers that be can draw a line and determine, well, first of all, what value is and what profit is and who will survive and on what terms. So I agree with you. I mean, I think that could happen, but I think that the discourse has changed because there's conventional accounting clarity in what they're saying. And for example, one of the things I learned through this, because the economy and maybe other parts of the government have really been a black box in many ways. You don't know how they operate. Well, apparently, Cuban companies used to operate on what I see as a cost plus basis. They would calculate their costs, and then they would be assigned a margin of profit to those costs, and that would be the profit. And so the incentive was to have lots of costs. And the way you would do that is have a really big payroll. Big payroll means a big cost base, means a bigger margin. It's like the socialist version of cost disease, which universities struggle with.
It was a nice choice of word.
Right, yeah, it's a struggle. It's a struggle. But so I was like, oh, that's how they used to do some of this accounting. It makes sense. I mean, it doesn't make financial sense, but I can see what the problem was. So they're moving away from that. They may have moved away from that fully, and like you say, there's no guarantee that that they're going to discipline themselves. It's very hard to. It's like the Ulysses myth. Ulysses is always used as an example of a pre-commitment mechanism. He ties himself to the mast, and so he can hear the sirens without going down with the ship. And that's how central bank independence should be. It's hard for governments to do that.
Especially. That's right, especially when governments, and again, this is the problem, when governments are committed to an ideological perspective, which makes it practically impossible to apply the ideological baggage inherent in a more accounting, Western, liberal democratic, markets-driven accounting mechanism for the ordering of their economy.
Absolutely. And that's why this is an economic reform, but it's an important cultural reform.
Right.
And I think it's not being called the rectificación, but I think you could see it as a modification of socialist doctrine of equality. Because what I have heard repeatedly is
that's a big taboo.
Well, and that's why I think this is a big deal, because I've heard Mr. Murillo and others say there may be inequality based on a differential contribution to the economy. And that I was like, oh my God. And and he talks about this new wage scale, and he said people who contribute more make more.
All right. Now this is very interesting, because in a sense he's echoing, not identical, but he's echoing what Deng Xiaoping talked about right at the beginning of reform and opening up in the 80s and early 90s. The difference is Deng Xiaoping then went on and had the second part. Sure, there will be differentials, but the reason for differentials is because we need to mobilize productive forces so that eventually we will make enough money, or add enough wealth so that it can be redistributed properly so that eventually we will all be where we're supposed to be, which is at some level of sufficient equality. Where the Chinese are still working through that, and now the story is of course always more complicated than heroic moments in ideology. But even at the beginning, there was a notion that yeah, we can accept this different contribution. You can keep some, but always with the idea that that was temporary and necessary for the increase in the aggregate production of wealth, which eventually would have to be, at some point when it becomes sufficient enough, would have to be distributed in an equitable way, understanding equity to be ideologically equitable.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm happy you said that, and that's going to make me rethink that part of the paper, because I mean, I don't know if Deng Xiaoping read Rawls and if he agrees with the min-max condition, but it's in that vein, and I think that so too are these reforms, because again, what Mr. Murillo has said, and he's very clear, he says these reforms don't increase the size of the pie. These reforms on their own do not increase output. So what he says is we are distributing in a different way what we have now, our existing wealth. And he's been very clear about that.
But to what ends?
Well,
mere redistribution gets you nowhere. It's got to be redistribution to an ends, and the ends has to be to either an increase in output or an increase in aggregate wealth. Otherwise, none of this makes sense.
Well, it's interesting, and I think this is why I find him credible, because he's not making grand promises, and I find that I like that in a person, and he's saying, we expect that output will increase, and we hope that some of these austerity measures are temporary because they're being imposed during this transition. We hope, but he's equally tentative about, there will probably be more devaluations of the peso. So what I find credible about the way that Tarea is being presented is the expectations are modest. They are modest, and it's not Rawlsian, because he's not saying, and we'll only allow the inequalities that benefit the poorest. We'll only allow someone to make 10 times more than the lowest wage scale if we can tax them such that the poorest are better off. He doesn't say that. He's more open-ended. But the Tarea, it reaffirms the revolution's traditional welfare commitments. It does, but it restates the equality axiom. It's not the same axiom, and I think that's interesting. We were recently we were at the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. You chaired this fascinating. You chaired a couple of fascinating panels, and one of the questions I asked was, I think this was to Mr. Catá, was how different is what the Tarea from a structural adjustment program done by the IMF? And I was relieved to hear him say, well, it's quite similar. They should have cut more subsidies. In the event of a real structural adjustment program, subsidies would have been cut more. It wouldn't have been gradual. It would have been a more dramatic, yes, cut, and like what happened with some post-Soviet, republics,
right,
and
exactly.
You fend for yourself, but I thought, wow, and these are people who are IMF economists, and I thought, what that tells me is that what the Tarea is it's a socialist version of structural adjustment. But it's doing some of the hard stuff. It is definitely doing some of the hard stuff. It's not doing enough to make neoliberals coup. I mean, that would have to be like Lord Shiva destroying the world. I mean, that's the scale that it takes to get the approval of certain extreme free marketeers. It's not that,
Well,
but
it's not that, but it's not that anywhere, even in their own homes.
oh,
Um,
probably,
so, I mean,
probably.
everyone worships the ideal, and everyone loves to experiment with the ideal in someone else's house. Um,
Sure.
but one shouldn't look too carefully at one's own place when one is making these profound statements. And so
Uh,
I always take them with a grain of salt.
Indeed, indeed. But you know, free marketeers don't. I mean, there's a kind of
Yeah, yeah,
orthodoxy.
yeah, yeah,
There's a,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and so this is not, and you know, Cuba has often been a wonderful counterexample of its own orthodoxy. But this reform seems, it seems really heterodox and not canonical and pragmatic and you know, fixing this here, fixing that there. I mean, it reminds me of, you know, Dodd-Frank. The Dodd-Frank Act was this behemoth reform, but it didn't have much of like an underlying theoretical unity. It fixed a lot of things in a lot of different areas, and this reform feels pragmatic. It feels pragmatic, you know, empirical, and you know, somewhat tentative. So I think it says something. I think what it signals is like there was this question when Fidel Castro left the presidency about what will happen now. And you know, of course, you had all of the, you know, the exile elite hoping, oh, this is finally the government will be toppled and we can, you know, we can go
Yeah.
back, and that didn't happen. And I think what you've seen is you know, socialism restating itself. And first there was Raul Castro, and I know he's still in the government. So this is not a post-Castro government, but it's a much more institutional, depersonalized, technical regime. And so what I get is, oh, you know, they're transitioning on their own terms, and it's not the Big Bang, but it's a series of little bangs. And and it's also, I mean, what the kind of exile infotainment model got wrong is the existence of all of these island elites and believers, people who were invisible, civil servants who were nameless, but who believed in the revolution as an institution. They still do. And now I think there's more room for those for that class. And so that's why I think, you know, if all goes well, the Tarea will help Cuba solve the problem of reinventing itself in a
Okay.
post-Castro landscape.
So you are tentatively positive.
I am, you know, I would have
All
to
right.
say that. I
All right.
really
All
am.
right. All
I
right.
am
All right.
tentatively, yes, I think already something important has been done. I mean, already, I mean, getting rid of the currency arbitrage and putting the accounts on a peso basis. Wow, and doing all this, I mean, this is like, you know, changing the chassis of a car as it's moving. I mean, they can't stop the economy. They have to keep doing all this. People have to keep working, but they just, you know, they make all of these changes in
Right.
motion.
Now, is
I
the
think that's
dollar,
interesting.
it is the dollar still the shadow currency?
Yes, I mean, it is. I mean, you know, it was the convertible peso was a proxy for the dollar. And I think there's no way out of that, given the gravitational pull of the US economy.
Right.
It's the natural market. I mean, it really is in so many ways. But it's you know, but it's dollarization Cuban style, which means you know, it will be original and they'll do it their own way.
All right. I have taken a tremendous amount of your time, but I have had so much fun. It's
Well,
just
me
been
too.
an incredibly engaging thing. And so what I wanted to do was kind of give you a chance to do two things. One, to give us some last thoughts, and as you do that, to tell us what you're working on now, so that we can wait expectantly to see your thoughts on paper.
Mm. Wow, well, I really appreciate it. Thank you for this opportunity. It's been really fun. Um, you know, I would say just a couple of things about the value of studying Cuba.
Okay.
It really has, I mean, the Cold War is over. The Cold War is over, but elements of it continue to survive. And part of why Cuba has so much value is it is a museum from the Cold War to a certain extent. And it's also, it's like the land that because of its situation, because it wasn't integrated into the Bretton Woods mainstream, it hasn't been normalized into the globalization structure. And that makes it interesting. It's also a place where the economy is so weird that you see things and in different ways that you don't see in economies that are more, normalized. So I think there's just enormous value. And it's funny, a personal thing that I learned, I learned to budget by visiting Cuba, because Cuba was the first place in the world I would go with a certain amount of money that had to last me, because I couldn't get a credit card, I couldn't get cash. And it was the first day where every day I would have, like, how much do I have today? And I would try to build up surpluses every day by not spending. And I thought, oh my God, this is rationing. This is the first time in my life that I've had to ration, because in the world, we don't have to ration. You may not have money, but you can get credit. So I found that very interesting. And again, I would encourage, I would conclude by encouraging people to make up their own mind about all of this. And I think the only way is by going to Cuba and engaging. And so I'm optimistic that this new administration will make that easier. In terms of what I'm working on, the article is it's called Cuban Socialism 2.0, and it's an analysis of what led to monetary and exchange dualism, and what the reform does and what it means. So that's the main thing I'm working on. And when I'm done with that, I will go back to a monograph on banking that I'm a little behind on. My interest in was banks as borrowers, financial institutions as borrowers looking for finance. And so that book is about, it's about the right-hand side of the balance sheet and how financial institutions finance themselves. And so I'll be doing that, and a case book on banking. But I'm very grateful that I'm getting to do this now. And again, I'm really grateful for the chance to have spoken with you today.
Oh, no, it is our great pleasure. And you can be sure that we are going to continue this conversation. Again, we will have you
Okay,
back
that's a promise.
We will have you back on, especially as the tarea either goes forth gloriously to some sort of positive result, or goes forth and just se que es un fracaso. Right. Either way, we'll have lots to talk about.
Okay.
All right. So again,
good to see you.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you folks for listening, and stay tuned. You're welcome to visit this interview and others on our YouTube page, and send us your comments, send us your requests, and send us questions that I can pass along to Jose.